Today in Agronomy on KFIL AM 1060 with Pioneer Field Agronomist Allie Wise and Josh Schaffner. Here's Josh and Allie.
Good morning, Southeast Minnesota. Today is episode 57. It's January 27th, 2021. Good thing I got that right this week, Josh. I'm still stuck in 2020 some days, I think. But, right now, I think if we're to be talking about the weather, obviously we have a fresh blanket of snow, which, like we mentioned, the rootworm are happy. So we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later in the show and what are some things we should be thinking about around that. But, really it actually is an interesting time of the year from both of our perspectives, because we're getting to that planning phase of, really digging a little bit deeper into some of the things that we're planning out for this 2021 growing season that, honestly, in some ways feels like it'll be here before we know it. But from that aspect, so we are going to split today's show in between. Let's talk about those things that we should be considering planning this crop out on the soybean side in segment 1, and then we'll shift focus to corn in segment 2. So as always, there's always so many things that we could talk about. But I think it's important to plan out this crop and what are some things that we need to consider or be trying as we look towards 2021.
Yeah. And, we were prepping for this show, Allie, and I would just, sometimes when you're, getting from point A to B on the road, you're just thinking about, the current situation and the corn and bean markets have moved a lot, and, definitely start thinking ahead of, opportunity, and you start to do the math on yield versus this price versus where we kind of were a lot of last year. And, I think it's a positive outlook and a lot of opportunity. And sometimes when you start thinking about that, you think back to, maybe the last time, commodity prices went on a run like this. And, I just remember times where, had really good crops, with yields with those prices. But then I also think back to, oh man, what are some things that went wrong with some operations that, we had those commodity prices, but what are some things that caught us off guard? And I thought maybe it'd be good to review each crop and think about, what are those biggest risk factors as we get ready for this year. And in Allie, I think I'll kick off on a soybean standpoint. Maybe this is a little different angle, but when you think about soybeans, we usually think a lot about disease, and it seems like maybe soybean acres, could be up a little bit this year. And I know historically in Southeast Minnesota, we talk a lot about white mold, but I'm also maybe going to think one of our biggest risk factors, might be sudden death syndrome as we think about this. And Allie, one thing, we talk about SDS a lot, but I think you start pairing that with our big push and drive to plant earlier, that maybe SDS could continue to become a bigger risk factor than what we've been used to.
Yeah, because like you said, with us, we understand the benefit that earlier planning can have to us on both the corn and soybean sides, but for this purpose, soybeans. And it feels like we could be trending towards another spring that's going to give us a nice opportunity to get in a little bit earlier. But even when those conditions are fit, we're still facing some of those cooler conditions. And, one thing I had mentioned to you is that, not suggesting we're going to have a drought, but it does look like we could potentially have drier conditions this spring again. And, we experienced a lot of temperature fluctuations between kind of the cold and warm springs yet this spring. So, it does just bring up the importance, I think, of thinking about that seed treatment, adding that addition to your soybean, just making it a standard part of your plan to protect against, diseases, even nematodes in some cases, being kind of a silent yield robber there. So there's a lot of different angles, but I think if we're going to push that yield early on, let's protect ourselves as best we can moving forward for the whole growing season.
Yeah, and that's where I think just really looking at that, iLevo seed treatment is what we're really trying to get at. And we know that's, maybe bringing Allie, $11, $12 additional cost, just give or take, just throwing some numbers out there. Don't hold us to that. But you look at, maybe less than a bushel of beans to pay for that. And you think about if we're planting really early, we increase the risk there. And we think that's an investment of, you look at, how do we make sure we protect that yield, that we're, getting that return is probably going to be a very high probability, and getting big return on that. If we get some SDS could be there. Another thing, Allie, we talk about weeds, obviously things like water hemp, giant ragweed, not getting easier to control. Extremely important that we got to control weeds in soybeans to maximize yield. But, with that, we got a lot going on in the soybean world. You think about, we're kind of transitioning out of straight Roundup Ready 2 Xtend from our standpoint into the Enlist system. Also in the industry, we see Xtend Flex come to market. With new systems and new trait packages brings a whole slew of new varieties. And think about variety selection from a standpoint of disease control, but also when you think about herbicide systems, risk of what's going on around us. We saw, a lot of, dicamba puckering and damage last year, but I think a lot of different angles to look at that, Allie, when you think about all the new systems coming to market as well.
Yeah, I think first focusing on, like you said, with the newer trade options coming, I think it is going to be important to take the time to have that conversation with your neighbor of which trait package are they planting? Does that vary from the system that you're going to be using across your operation? And then even taking that one step farther, like we talked about, some operations are going to be planting more than one trait. So just having a plan in your head of how we're going to keep that separate, how are we going to protect ourselves from damaging that soybean crop when we're in the heat of the spraying season, this growing season. And from a white mold perspective, like you said, with a lot of new varieties and systems, we know that understanding the strengths of varieties around some of these disease scores is very important. So, it's exciting we're bringing newer options to the market, but certainly just make sure that we're understanding and placing those products as best we can based off of the scores that we do know to date. So a couple of different things to consider in the soybean side of things. And certainly I think we could talk about this all show long, but when we come back, we'll maybe dig a little bit more into the corn side of things.
Welcome back, listeners. Segment 1, Allie, kind of went quick there, but kind of covered, a few risk factors there to be thinking about. And maybe to summarize that, I think the biggest thing there is, as you just start laying out your varieties and your planting plan, just reviewing those questions, talk to one of us, talk to your Pioneer sales rep, just triple checking some of those things what do I need there? And if you didn't make a decision, on seed treatment or a levo uptick, maybe having that conversation, what's the cost, what's the risk, what's the benefits, and, just making sure we got those things right so we don't overlook something like that. And, managing SDS, once we kind of put it in the ground, that's kind of our plan. We don't really have a rescue option for that other than the variety or the seed treatment that we can put on there. So moving into corn, Allie, we've talked quite a bit about tar spot last summer, last winter. We talked about a little bit of summary of some work we did this summer. And the biggest thing, if we were here a year ago, we talked about, hey, it's in a couple counties around us. Now we've confirmed that basically in every county that you and I cover and kind of into our listeners, our listing area here. And to me, it's something that knowing that it can, be up to a 30 to 50% yield robber, here's something that, if we're not thinking about this disease at the right time, it could be something that, we could roll into August 1st. Our crop looks awesome. We're thinking, hey, we're going to have 240, 50 bushel. And 3 weeks later, tar spot could come in and we might end up with 150 bushel. That's the risk factor. So what are some things, Allie, in your mind that we should be thinking about when it comes to tar spot?
Well, I think first off, when we hear of tar spot, and it obviously still is relatively newish to us, even though it is here in a greater force, like we talked about. But, the first thing our mind goes to, I think, is always fungicides. But actually, I think we want to keep our focus on the number one thing being hybrid selection. And the reason being, there aren't any hybrids that currently in North America that we could say are resistant to tar spot. So it's only a matter of finding those hybrids that are going to be able to fight off tar spot, essentially. So we have a great indication of the varieties that have that hybrid tolerance. So difference between tolerance and resistance. So it's going to be really important just to identify those hybrids and how we can best place those on your acres moving into 2021. Certainly it's a developing disease, and fungicide, like I said, that's not my number one, but it still does make the list. Fungicide is going to be, huge in terms of suppression of tar spot. And I think timing becomes maybe the next question on that, Josh, but we could spend a whole show on tar spot, but just making sure that we're focusing on the factors that we can control, knowing that tar spot is here in Minnesota.
Yeah. And the timing, I'm not going to get into a lot of time, timing of the fungicide, it's likely going to be tassel. And even after, it's going to be a different timing that we could potentially have to go out there if this disease comes in. The other thing about the timing that's kind of scary, Allie, is when a lot of times when you go through your summer and the growing season and the scouting process, it's really busy, June, July, you think about from soybean aphids to some scouting, but it also seems like too, that once you get to like the first, second week of August, it seems like a lot of us just want to get out of the field, take a break because harvest is coming, it's busy. However, tar spot's going to interrupt that because that's the time we're really going to have to be scouting. And I think also just think about, who's going to be looking at my crops? Am I going to be out there? Do I got somebody that's keeping an eye on my crops for us? Allie, we're obviously out in the field all the time. We'll be sending alerts and bulletins if we see something, but but also knowing that tar spot can, maybe I got one speck out there and 2 weeks later you could have really serious infestations that, maybe just thinking about what is going to be my game plan to try to stay ahead of this if it's really starting to show up, and just maybe building a team of people or resources. I even think about directive scouting, looking at imagery of something. If it picks it up that, wow, something changed here, do I need to get out there, kind of get in front of it? Those might be some things to be thinking about of how do we manage this disease. That the timing of when it really takes off can be scary, because it's the time that a lot of us tend to vacate the field, but it's going to be a critical time that we got to be out there making sure this disease isn't setting in.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. And just kind of for time, we're going to move on to maybe next topic that one should consider. And I think that'd be a maturity mix. So sometimes we experienced an earlier spring last year, which allowed us to push our maturities a little bit greater. But picking your maturities, I think, can become a very emotional thing. We can swing too drastically one way or the other, dependent on what the weather maybe gave us that particular year. So just your thoughts on maybe what is our maturity sweet spot? What are kind of those ditches we should just live within?
Yeah, I don't ever like to take operations through a roller coaster. That I just like to draw a bell curve, and we're probably 100 to 102, relative CRM sweet spot, and making sure that probably half year maturities are landing there. You got 25% above and below is just a really dumbed down, simple way that I really encourage growers to look at it. The one thing, Allie, I've been digging that data. It seems like maybe growers pushed a little later CRM on average this year. And I think sometimes when you look at data, it's not that early corn didn't perform, but relative to higher maturity, we just saw more yield, which is common. But, there's always risk of what is the growing season going to deliver. But maybe just reviewing that and thinking about, am I landing close to that average sweet spot, or did I swing one way or the other? Could be something to fine tune before we get to planting season.
Another thing that unfortunately we ran out of time for today will be corn rootworm. And we understand we've talked about this a lot, but we will probably put that back on the docket for shows to come, just to make sure that we are covering ourselves as best as we can as we move into this year. Certainly, as you have any questions as you're getting to the planting time of the year, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Today in Agronomy on KFIL AM 1060. If you've missed part of the show or want to hear more, check out the show page at kfilradio.com or with the 103.1 KFIL app. Stay connected with Allie and Josh on Twitter. It's at AllieGWise, WISE, and at Josh Schaffner to submit your questions for the show. Tune in next Wednesday for the next Today in Agronomy on KFIL AM 1060